Thank you. Now we're going to hear from Strategic Office Networks.
Jim Clifton is the CEO and chairman of Gallup Poll, and he recently authored this book called The Coming Jobs War. Gallup organization 5 years ago decided that it was important to use behavioral economics to consider what people were thinking, and that it was very important in understanding the transactional economics of what they were doing. Of the world's 7 billion people, they came to the conclusion this past year that what was uppermost in people's minds was having access to a job. Not just any job, but a formal job. And that today 3 billion people compete for 1.2 billion jobs. And that if America is going to continue its dominance as a leader in the world, it's going to have to innovate. And that innovation is going to have to occur in one of 100 cities throughout the United States. I'm Michael Scheer, and I'm the founder of Strategic Office Networks, and I'm here to say it's all about access. In fact, accessibility is the key ingredient of well-being and prosperity in contemporary societies. This was a quote from an executive summary of the UN and World Bank report done 10 years ago. They pointed out there's 3 methods of access: transportation and land use. This is where we spend a tremendous amount of our time in designing our cities and our communities today. There's a very long lead time. They point out transportation is the most costly and damaging. And telecommunications, which they say is the least leveraged. So our belief is that if we can find a more holistic way to harness telecommunications as a method of access, we can expand access, we can reduce its cost, and we come up with a model approach that can be implemented much more quickly than our traditional methods of access. So where do we start? Well, we look at remote working today and the way that we've attempted to use it, and what we find is that there are 130 a million commuters every day that go out on our roads or in our mass transit systems. And we estimate some 50 to 60 million of those are knowledge-based workers and could and would work remotely if we had a model that worked. But on any given day, only 3 million of those people do that. And so the question we have to come up with is, what's the behavioral economic argument under this, and why is it that this works some of the time for some of the people, but given the magnitude of the challenges we have today, isn't holistic enough and doesn't include enough people in the knowledge-based economy? So we started to look at, well, what are the systemic underpinnings of this? And we said, well, we had an industrial age economy at one time. We brought all the tools of productivity to a single location. Well, we continued that when we moved across the highways to our office complexes. And so today we still maintain this single location mentality. Unfortunately, it pits one community against a neighboring community to try to bid for the next big employer. And as a consequence, we say that one community wins that contract, but in essence, everybody pays for the transportation costs, the air pollution, and of course, the drain on our economy in terms of gasoline usage. So we said, well, if it can't be the single location model anymore, what else could it look like and how would we get there? So we started to look at economies of scale and the social and cultural elements that define our workplace. And we said, you know, it really starts to look like something the retailers figured out years ago, which was if I had a downtown location, I could, of course, support my retail sales to a certain portion of the population. But if I engaged with other retailers and became anchor tenants in regional malls, I could push my goods out closer to where people lived. So the distributed workplace model is to try to find a more permanent, more holistic approach to extending jobs and localizing job accesses to a larger set of communities. So the distributed work centers are based on density, and the first one is that social and cultural identity. The way we work, when we go to work, our identity of the organization we work for is preserved in this kind of telesuited arrangement. By collecting a multiple number of telesuites into a center itself, we now reach the economies of scale that justify the kinds of broadband infrastructure that can deliver the advanced telecommunication services that are available today. So the density is a very critical element in this kind of design. Our team are entrepreneurs. They're a diverse set of individuals with skill sets that complement each other, but with a common belief that we have to go after re-engineering our local economies more aggressively, and that broadband must play an integral part in it. So our business is to become consultants to communities and regions on their information economy and to facilitate the creation of locally owned and operated joint ventures or public-private partnerships, and to license the model that has been patented called the multi-location distributed workplace network. So the consulting services, if you look at the map of Kansas City here, we've shown the white areas there are where the concentrations of job employments are. The red areas is where the population densities are starting to grow. And so we look at a discovery and assessment phase where we start to look at the employers in the area and then how best to look or examine their aggregate hiring patterns so that we can best identify what would a distributed architecture look like. The project planning phase is really where we bring together the collective of the local community with their expertise and establish this public-private partnership to follow through on commercial real estate, technologies, and put together the final scope of plan for project implementation, which is where we finally start to migrate an employer's employees into these centers. So connecting to the Google Fiber back to the density model by having these larger number of peoples deployed in a permanent site location, it now can justify T3, DS3, or even OC3 backbones between the centers and also connecting the organizations in the metropolitan location. It also lends itself nicely then to the integration of additional value-added services, cloud computing, collaborative tools, unified messaging, and virtual presence technologies. So who'll buy this? We're marketing this to Council of Governments, metropolitan planning organizations, and others who have an interest in the social and economic growth of communities. The licensing of the model will be then presented to the public-private partnership. Why? Because this improves job access for a large number of knowledge-based workers in the community. It creates new jobs in the way of technology support for this kind of infrastructure. It converts gasoline dollars into local economy dollars, and it immediately has that impact. Plus, because it is a permanent deployment of personnel, it has a predictable impact on traffic congestion and improves air quality. So we're really after improving the community and its work, play, live attributes. In Kansas City, we might expect as many as 15 distributed places to support upwards to 10,000 distributed workers. That's a reduction of 90 million vehicle miles per year, an annual fuel savings or conversion to local economy dollars of some 15 million, and the creation of almost 200 jobs at about a $9 million payroll. So we look at creating these public-private partnerships in metropolitan areas using the Texas Transportation Institute's Urban Mobility Study, who says there's over 430 metropolitan areas across the country that transportation congestion is a problem. We looked at the top 150 of those, and based on that, we extrapolated the number of centers that each could possibly support and came up with 150 networks with an aggregate of 1,600 work centers. So if you look at a revenue model then for strategic office networks, we look at about a $60 million consulting fees for those 150 metropolitan areas, along with residuals of about $240 million in terms of license fees. So our competitive advantages, today's consultants to our communities on visioning where we're going really ignore the knowledge-based economy and knowledge workers and broadband as infrastructure. We understand its critical nature, not only in terms of meeting our current challenges, but developing a foundation for generations to come. So it's a proactive approach to develop a more sustainable economic growth plan and workplace improvement. We estimated an initial investment of approximately $300,000 would be used to do these kind of functions, construct a GIS database, create license and partnership agreements, develop schematic best practices, architectural plans, establish a database and website development for the gathering of information, and marketing and business development materials, as well as travel and expenses for presentations. I said that we looked at transportation, we looked at energy, we looked at environment, but there's a couple other areas here, and that is that Homeland security and preparedness have become key aspects of this in terms of proactive deployment of personnel. So if we look at Kansas City one more time, you'll see the white dots here are employers. And if we look at their aggregate hiring plans in the area, we might find that the network of centers is established to extend to a lot of communities, and as such, we extend employment opportunities on a localized basis to upwards to 10,000 people with this kind of approach. Thank you very much.
Questions from the judges?
Are you building new offices?
No, in fact, the ideal would be to reuse existing underutilized real estate. I know that in Kansas City here, you've got a campus down there, Sprint, that's got some 40% vacancy. You've got a downtown building here that's at 48% vacancy. So the idea here is to balance the equation a little bit. People are living downtown but commuting out to the suburbs. Why not put a center in that vacant space here? Likewise, people coming from the south going to another suburb in the north, again, create a center where we have underutilized real estate. Good question.
Another question here?
You're familiar with the concept of Cisco's connected work centers?
Absolutely.
What is your, they have not taken off as far as I know. What's your critique on that, and what are you doing better and different?
Yeah, and I've spent quite a few years, and again, that's an excellent question. Why do we seem to be failing when the technologies are here? And I think it's the model approach. And the model approach that why our model approach is different is that we look at the major employers and their existing hiring patterns. And so that we build on what's there as opposed to implement technology and hope that people will come use it. In the Amsterdam case, where we've gotten the most excitement about these kind of processes, what you find is that within Amsterdam itself, it only has 2 centers. Well, our research would say that Amsterdam probably can support at least a dozen centers if they're networked properly with the right anchor tenants. So it's really about this multi-location, multi-employment model, much like retailers figured out with retail malls. I can go to a Sears in the Northwest, I can go to one in the Southeast, but they're present at each point. And so that's the same dimension that we're proposing here, is that the major employers become the anchor tenants in the creation of this kind of multi-tenant, multi-location model.
Another question?
So,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
All right, down there, and we'll come back to you.
We're curious if you are familiar with some of the, and you must be, the workplace management solutions like AgileQuest and like PeopleCube out of Europe and all of that.
Yes.
And you didn't talk a lot about your competition. So, how do you perceive the competitive landscape, and where do you sit vis-a-vis these existing and fairly entrenched tools?
Well, we are a community-centric approach, and I think that's one of the key aspects that differentiates us. So rather than look at an industry-specific set of needs, where a technology company may come in and say, we have a solution for the hospitals, we have a solution for education. Our approach is to say, let's look at the community. What is the knowledge-based resources and requirements in the community, so that we can better organize our resources and understand how do we get a economies of scale model that meets all of those requirements when we go through the building block process. So we start with the workforce because we think that America's workforce is engaged in a global competition today that really requires us to expand access and reduce its cost phenomenally if we're going to be able to survive the kind of wage pressures that exist in this country. I didn't even get into the things about oil, its availability, some of the issues around the geopolitical circumstances that we're faced with. So there's a whole variety of issues, but in short, the answer to your question is that we really take a community-centric view of how to build telecommunications as infrastructure for economic development for the community at large.
Back down here, you had a question?
Yes, it's also yet another competitive analysis question. Why is this better than work at home? Clearly, and it's Google fiber to the home that we're talking about here.
Correct. And believe me, I am a big encourager of people being able to, that can work at home, working at home. A gigabit is a lot to swallow. And if, as a broadband service provider, you want to make that economically sing, you've got to find a lot of information and a lot of predictable users to support that kind of economic investment. So we're looking at the fact that, number one, the numbers tell us that there's behavioral economics under those 47 to 57 million people that are still getting in their cars. That there are social and cultural aspects for those people about the way we work, being associated, and their understanding of being in the workplace as opposed to working from home, and that many people do not have the environment or perhaps the skill sets to be able to work successfully at home the way it's structured today. So it's not to say that we should be deterred from doing those things, but it's to say we have so many challenges, we need to come up with a broader set of methodologies to localize work opportunities as fast as we can in our communities. Does that answer your question?
Next question.
Have you had conversations with big employers here or with government officials to see what the receptivity is?
Well, I've been working in D.C., and of course the federal government to me is obviously both an opportunity and a challenge. Here we have a federal legislation that's been on the books for a decade and just reiterated last year telework legislation. The federal government has almost 2 million people that work for it. They have an objective of at least 1 million people working at home 1 or 2 days a month. They are now, after 10 years, at 150,000. So here we are 10 years later, and they've achieved less than 15% of what their objective was in a 4-year time frame. So if you project that out, we should, in 100 years, have the federal government meet its objective. So my concern here in Kansas City would be the same thing. If we want to respond to emergencies, and of course we have weather-related, natural occurrences, and man-made. And so emergencies, in my gravest concern, are those that we cannot predict. And if we have to rely on a centralized model where evacuation is our first level of response, it will cost dearly. If we have a deployed workforce that has an engineered backbone capacity that can put people proactively in a posture using technologies day in and day out that they're going to be called upon to use to respond to an emergency, we can save a lot of lives and a lot of money. So to answer your question, I would love to continue to engage with the federal government on that line. So.
And with that, we're out of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.